Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Thought Leaders, where we bring in different leaders from their areas of expertise, and we have them share what best practices look like based on their typically decades-long plus experience. And today's no different. We've got Paul Asadoorian, who is a security expert. Has been doing this for a long, long time. Paul, happy to have you on the show, and please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm Paul Asadoorian, and so my day job today is a principal security evangelist for a company called Eclypsium. We do firmware and supply chain security. Kind of speaks to my passion and interest in firmware security that I've had across my career. I'm also a podcaster, so I started the Security Weekly network of podcasts 19 years ago. Exited that in 2020. And I've got a lot of other projects and podcasts. I'm gonna start spinning back up the Stogie Geeks podcast, so still love all the podcasting things.
Very cool. Um, as we typically like to do, we kind of want to talk about the origination story of kind of how you got into the space that you're in now, right? You've been one of those people that's been committed to a single category, single vertical for a long, long time. Obviously, it's evolved. You probably figured out different niches where you're more of an expert in, but walk us through just the initial interest in getting into security. Where did that stem from? Is that something you imagined out of high school, going to college, or something you're going to do, or how did it begin?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I started computer programming when I was 7 years old, which is pretty amazing. I have my parents to thank for kind of pushing me in that direction. And then as I progressed through high school, really, I started this like newfound love of technology. And then in college, when I applied for my first internship, I had to actually write some source code on a whiteboard. So I've always been in love with technology and computers. And so that was really eye-opening. It was actually a point of sale company that I worked for. And I just kind of fell into security like so many. My story is as I progressed with my career, I was working for a lottery company and the firewall person got sick. And so my boss came to me and was like, well, you know all this technology stuff, Unix systems, and they're like, can you do the security stuff? I'm like, yeah, that sounds really interesting. And it was like, love at first sight. I'm like, I don't want to do anything else but security because this is just so dynamic. It's so interesting. There's so much to learn, and it's ever changing. The attacker landscape has changed so much over time. And I've just been in security, ever since.
Interesting. So it was maybe like breaking out of the monotony of what you were maybe dealing with before. And yeah, like you're saying, I mean, somewhat like the Wild West, that's kind of what you're doing, right? From you have to manage like defenses and then also somewhat be more offensive and proactive in terms of how you think about security a lot of times, even though a lot of companies probably are more defensive than anything else. But you're trying to talk about threading both sides of the needle there. Um, as you kind of got, so when you got into that first experience with the lottery system, like what was like the use case that they were dealing with that you're coming in to help solve, specifically there? And then, obviously I think as you maneuvered through different companies, and clients as you worked with throughout your career, how has that changed?
Yeah, I think, back in the day, in the lottery days, it was very much infrastructure security. So it was firewalls, it was defending systems.
Yeah.
And, back in that time, late 90s, early 2000s, that's where security was trying to defend against that remote attacker that was directly attacking a computer system. Certainly we've seen many changes over the years to things like phishing as we shored up our defenses on the network side. And then, protecting our endpoints today with advanced technologies is pushing attackers into different areas. So back then I think my passion, Chris, and really why it's kept my interest is because I have to be a detective. Whether I'm attacking systems or defending systems, there's always this like detective work. Much to my kids' chagrin, they can't pull anything past, dad, because I'm always in that detective mode. Like, why did that happen? Where's the evidence of why that happened? Where's the evidence that that system's vulnerable? And how do I fix it? And on the attacker side, where is it vulnerable? And then how do I attack it? So I love that constant detective work.
Yeah, I mean, it's an intrinsic curiosity. I feel like, is that something that you feel like you always grew up with? And like, um, I'm just trying to imagine you as a kid playing, like being the detective and going out there trying to solve crimes. And then, this is the digital version of that, but it's very much related to it.
Yeah, and I think there's the curiosity in technology too. Like, what can I make
Yeah,
these computer systems do that they didn't intend to do?
yeah,
Whether that was a gaming system, early on, or whether that was my first computer, which was like an Apple IIe. Like, how do I tell it to do things that it wasn't intended to do? And I think that's, carried forward today where I have a healthy obsession with ordering electronics from AliExpress and just seeing like, what can they do? What are the possibilities here?
interesting.
So it's a lot of fun.
Very cool. Um, so as you kind of got more into out of the lottery company and then more into I feel like more of like a corporate environment of different types of like enterprise companies. Um, and doing that for now 20 years, has there been themes like walk us through like the timeline of how the security landscape has changed in your opinion based on your experience, right? And over let's say like the past 20 years, what's been I'm from like a layman's perspective of like, you know, what you talked about was important in the very beginning of like the firewalls, but like after that, what was kind of the next few years of like people were trying to put a fire out here, put a fire out there, and then how did it start escalating into maybe like the past few years?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's been, in my mind, like one big change, Chris, right? And that is in the early days. So we're talking like 80s, 90s, and even
Yeah,
early 2000s. The attackers or hackers, air quotes hackers, were largely independent people that were satisfying curiosity, maybe breaking the law, but exploring systems largely because they were there because they could, right? There wasn't a
yeah,
monetary business behind it that was starting to form. Certainly, there was some, early hacking cases that tie back to espionage and or making money. But for the large part, people were just hacking because they were curious because they could. That landscape started to shift when malicious actors figured out they could make a business out of it.
yeah,
And then, so as we get into the 2000s, you start seeing attackers forming groups with the goal of making money in various ways. Credit card theft and scams were probably the beginnings of how attackers were making money. And, that led to the creation of PCI, and people had to really safeguard that credit card data, which has done its job of shifting attackers to other things. The next big evolution of ransomware, which started out in the early days, but what the big change there was the cryptocurrency, right? Which really enabled attackers to monetize,
yeah,
right? Because they could collect money, air quotes money,
yeah,
in air quotes anonymous form,
yeah.
but that really shifted everyone going, oh, we can really form a business around it. And then, that has ties to nation state hacking. And nation states, of course, are doing espionage, but also using it to generate money for their country. North Korea is a shining example of, their nation state actors are largely focused on generating income for the country of North Korea. So, those are that shift led to really the formation of cybersecurity, the formation of many governments, formalizing their cybersecurity strategy in various departments and groups and policies, because people started taking it more seriously in terms of a business. When we look at this today, Chris, it's very similar to organized crime. You have many, many different groups, all with their different specialties that interact with each other, use each other's services, have a hierarchy, a business plan, in some cases, even healthcare that really operates like a legitimate company, except they're cyber criminals.
Interesting, interesting. It is very much like a detective. Uh,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Um, Now, I mean, obviously, you have security also in like the government systems, and then you have it in the private space. And when you're working with companies, like, how are you? I guess to my question is like, uh, what is the level of concern for some of those things, like like espionage and things like that in a corporate environment? And um, how do you start? Is there a way that you start like auditing where a company's security weaknesses are, and then how do you prioritize for those weaknesses?
Yeah, and today, Chris, like everyone's a target, right? I think that
Yeah,
was the big
gotcha.
shift that ransomware highlighted was that everyone is a target. And I think it used to be that, well, if you're a financial institution,
Mhm.
you certainly have assets to protect that are monetary. But today, everyone's a target. You could be a small school system or nonprofit or a large financial, and you're a target. And it's different. Like everyone's security program is different, but there are certainly, basics and fundamentals that largely defined by standards and guidelines. Here in the US, we have NIST. NIST provides many different guidelines. And even more recently, they take the larger sets of guidelines and they kind of distill it down into smaller subsets of those guidelines. And, largely, I think security boils down to just having good hygiene,
Yeah,
being good in information technology, and following those best practices is exactly where you start, right? Making sure you have a good asset inventory of everything in your environment. What hardware, software do you have? Which services are you using? And then prioritizing how do I keep those things up to date? How do I do maintenance on all of those things? Is certainly some of the fundamentals that uh, organizations have to get right today. Because if you don't get that right, someone's going to find it and you're going to be the victim of ransomware or some other kind of cybercrime.
interesting. Um, as you were mentioning that, I have a curiosity around, the different regulatory agencies and practices out there. The US is seemingly more looser than some other parts of the world, like the EU and things like that. Um, I had an interesting conversation with another cybersecurity expert yesterday, uh, that has his own philosophy stemming back to kind of like World War II and um, the issue of like the Germans, how they ended up utilizing information, so that became like a crux for solving for that problem in the very beginning, like that privacy, um, and becoming a priority for their constituents. But curious as to your thoughts on that, in terms of where the U.S. stands, and also, like with those looser regulations, is that the reason why companies like, OpenAI are able to be more like of a cowboy and operate in this world where, you know, they're kind of just defining the rules as they go, and the government's gonna play catch up later on.
Yeah, it's certainly a double-edged sword, Chris. In the US, I think we have favored capitalism,
Yeah.
versus some of these privacy regulations. And I don't always necessarily agree with the directions that we were going. The rumor has it that there were privacy regulations similar to GDPR in the
Mm,
early 2000s, and that was brushed aside after September 11th. And we
mm,
got the Patriot Act instead, which is the opposite
yeah,
of privacy regulations. And I think we're coming around. But certainly the EU and other countries are making great strides, in my opinion, in passing legislation, not just on privacy, but also on security as well. So in the EU, they are in the later stages of passing the CRA, um, Cyber Security Responsibility Act, I believe is the acronym, right? And that says basically if you're consuming goods and services and technology, it has to meet a minimum standard of security. The UK had just passed legislation that was introduced in 2022 that says when you get an IoT router that most people have in their homes, it has to have a good password and they have to follow this best practice hygiene that I've been preaching for a long time. And I was like, wow, I think that's a really big win. So certainly, other countries are a little more forward in terms of that regulation. I think the US is catching up, especially in regards to if you are going to do business with the US government, there's more stringent regulations on you have to know your supply chain and where all of your components and software comes from, and attest to that before you can do business with the US government. So there's efforts to even more formalize that process. And certainly PCI, I think, is a great win in terms of data security and cybersecurity because it forced organizations that process credit card numbers to basically not store them so cyber criminals can't steal them, right? And it accomplished its goal, and some of my people in my field complain about it, but it was the Wild West before we had a regulation like PCI. So I think younger Paul was like, I don't like government or regulations. Like we all need to be free. Older, more mature Paul is like, regulation has its place that can really have an impact to move our cybersecurity maturity forward as a country.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I still feel like especially in the US, like there is a lack of wide awareness from a consumer perspective. And you're talking about the general population around security. Like, I don't think people understand. I mean, I talk about this quite basically just with friends and family that are not in tech at all, and you see those cookies and the collecting of cookies and the
Hmm.
opt-in and opt-out kind of thing. And the opt-out, it actually make it difficult to opt out of, or more challenging to opt out of it. So it like creates a headache for you a little bit sometimes in different instances. Um, do you have any concern around that and just kind of like the education part of it for like just the general person in terms of like where their information is going and how that could actually be utilized against them if they're not as conscientious around it?
Yeah, and because I think the thing that I'd like everyone to understand is that when you get something for free, it's not free. You
Yeah,
are the product. And I had this conversation with my wife a couple of years ago. We live in Rhode Island, and there's a lot of Dunkin' Donuts, and Dunkin' Donuts has the app. And if you subscribe or install the app, you can get discounted and free coffee. And my wife's like, "This is great. I get free coffee." I'm like, "That's not really free. Like, your data is being exchanged for coffee."
yeah,
And she's like, but all I do is show the app and I get free coffee. And people don't understand that it's a give and take with your data. And I think that's the big kind of missing piece is that nothing is truly free. Your information's being bought, sold, and traded in some shape, form, or fashion. And you do, as a consumer, have control over most of that, depending on how far down the privacy path that you get, right? And I think most people are in the I don't care about privacy kind of thing.
yeah,
Privacy's dead and you have given up on it. And I think we need to reel the reins back in on that and say, no, you do have some control over your privacy. If the pendulum goes all the way to the other side, some of my good friends are really, really, really good at privacy, but it's a huge inconvenience, right?
yes,
So I
yeah.
think the answer is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that kind of goes into also, I think, the idea of like generative AI and how does that data plug into generative AI, and if you aren't um, more educated or educating yourself around the possibilities of what that can do, I think you get to a place where people don't even realize that they aren't really making their own decisions anymore.
Right.
Um, right? Like because a lot of it's just being funneled to them. Like there's going to be a the gap from your original thought to like a served thought, I think is just going to become uh wider and wider where you're or sorry, smaller and smaller where you're not going to understand the distinction at some point if you don't educate yourself. At
Right.
least like now because it's so fast. Any do you I mean when you think about that personally with your wife, with your family, your kids, etc., is that something that you care about? You want to educate them about? Because like 5 years from now, who knows what's going to be? How people are going to be using companies are going to be using our data?
Yeah, and I try and make things simple for my family as an example,
Yeah,
right? And what I've always told them is that whatever you put on the internet is there forever and other people will use it. And just because it's Snapchat and it looks like it's going away, it never really goes away. Just because you fed something into a Gen AI model doesn't mean it's erased. It's probably there. Actually, it is there forever to be used. So whatever you share online will be there forever. And
yeah,
social postings, everything, your location inside of Google, all of that stuff is very sticky. And some of it can be pretty scary. So every time you share something online, you have to do a risk analysis and go, is this worth it? What could someone do, with this information?
yeah,
And then also balance convenience too. I think I like the convenience of having a Google phone and a Google account. But I do understand that there's privacy and potentially security implications of that as well. If you go into your Google account, you'll see
yeah,
all of the different locations that you've been
yeah,
with your phone, right? And so some people don't like, they fight that level of privacy violation, but it comes at a cost too. So,
yeah, absolutely. Moving back to the corporate side of things, I had a few of the security experts we brought in. Like, I mean, their struggle kind of working with companies is bringing in budget, right, uh, for putting in the infrastructure or putting in to place some of these defenses that they need to have. A lot of the times, from I think a leadership perspective of like CEO, CFO, COO, I mean, like you have to explain it to them, but like they're thinking it from how does this impact revenue or how is this going to impact, our customer base? They're thinking about it from a business standpoint. Um, I think obviously when your market size is being affected by your security and the standards of what you have in place, that highlights the necessity to then go out and do these types of things. But is there a way to be, or is there, I mean, within your space, is there talks or narratives around how to shift that perspective for these decision-making leaders where it becomes more, um, yeah, more proactive in the earlier parts of it before it has to become an actionable item where the urgency becomes like all of a sudden we have to do it now and but getting ahead of it, maybe by 6 months, a year, 2 years.
Yeah, I think, we can sit here and say security is important, but when that goes to your board or your
Uh,
CEO, you need more than just security is important. And I think some of the driving factors, the number one driving factor that is compliance, right? And that ties into business that you won't be able to do business with
yeah,
other companies if you're not compliant with certain standards. So compliance to me is a big driver, probably the first driver to build your foundation. I think the next set is that consumers and your customers care about security more and more as well. They don't want to do business with a vendor or provider that has had, heinous security issues, because it can impact your business. So I think that educating the boards and CEOs that our customers care about security, for sure. That's not to say that everyone has to have perfect security. And I think some of it is solved with budget and technology things that you were mentioning, Chris, right? And you do need some of that. But more so you need a process, right, to deal with those security things. And I think the confidence that your customers will build with you is based on, yes, a base set of security measures, but also your process, right? Are you transparent when there's a breach? Or, do you have a good reporting system for people to externally report vulnerabilities? All those are kind of like good citizen things that breed confidence, because we all know that you can never get security perfect, right? Security is a constantly moving state. It's not a state that you reach and you're like, oh, I'm secure.
absolutely. um these are all great points. Moving into your podcast that you've been doing for the past, well, the one that you did that you exited, right? Security Weekly. What what got you started in that world of creating content within this space? Because I feel like it's not typical, right, for a security person to go and then want to
Yeah.
get in front of a camera and let alone like interview people and talk like. So what propelled you to do that in the first place? And then, what were maybe some of the takeaways from a content creator perspective in that space? What were some of the things that you found that you took away? Because there's things that I take away from these things as well
Yeah.
selfishly that I'm learning. But curious as to what that journey was like for you.
Yeah, and it's a great point, Chris. I consider myself like truly blessed to have sat down with so many smart people and my co-host like every week. And every week I learned something from my co-host and from my guests. So much of my experience and knowledge is really derived from doing the show. And that's kind of a selfish reason to do the
Yeah,
show,
yeah,
right? But
yeah,
it's certainly a benefit. The other reason is the community learns, right? If I'm learning, that
yeah.
means everyone listening is learning as well. So, increasing that knowledge and getting people into the field has been one of the most rewarding things. And it stems back from when I worked for a local university, here in Rhode Island. And I was presenting at that university on a monthly basis what was happening in security. This is like I started at the university in 2001, and then started just sharing like what's happening on, like, what am I seeing on the university network, and what am I seeing in the industry in terms of indicators and compromises. And all of the local sysadmins and technical people would attend, and they got a lot of value out of that. The feedback, was great. They're like, oh, we love sharing this update. And, political reasons or whatever, things change, and I wasn't able to present that any longer to the local university groups. And one of my coworkers, we like handles in the hacker space, his handle's Duck Sauce, and he was like, "You should do a podcast." And this is 2005, and I'm like, "Dude, what's a podcast?"
Yeah.
Right? And he's like, "Well, you get this Apple iPod, and you can subscribe." And so I started, I bought a secondhand, first generation iPod, and I started listening. And I was like, oh, this sounds like fun. I'm like, I think I can do this. So we went to a conference and we recorded a podcast. And then through friends that I had met, we were interviewing big name guests in our field, like right from the start. And lo and behold, people started listening. And look, my initial vision for the podcast was I want to get together with my friends and I want to drink beer and talk about security. And yeah, we're going to push record and maybe someone will listen. But it turns out a lot of people did listen. So, obviously it became more formalized over time. We very much latched on to the sponsorship model,
Yep.
early on. In fact, there was a cybersecurity vendor that bought us beer when we recorded episode one. So, like, technically from the beginning, we had, support in a sponsorship model, and that continued over time. So,
Sure.
doing it every week has been, a stress on me and my personal life, certainly, but that's a trade-off that I make because it's so much fun. Like, I still, every Wednesday now is just it's like a glorious day because I get to record a podcast. So I still do Paul Security Weekly. We're on like episode 800 and something. And it's still just a joy to talk with people and hang out with my friend. We still hang out and drink and talk about security for 3 hours.
That's awesome. Um, and then you said you ended up like selling that part, but you're still involved in it as well?
Yeah, so in 2020, I saw the need to diversify,
Yep.
right, from podcasting. I was like, well, I want to grow, but I'm gonna need to have other offerings,
Yep.
right? And so the acquisition was to an organization that had acquired some of those other offerings. I was like, well, this is a great fit. So we executed the acquisition. I left about a year later, and I still continue to do the podcast today, as a consultant, and push that the shows forward as well.
Very
Um,
cool.
so.
Cool. And so what you mentioned you're thinking about doing a few other ones going forward. What is outside of just the scope of what you do as an advisor and then at Evangelist, but what are you personally looking to do that's really like interesting for you? It seems like your profession is very much tied into your passion already. So curious as to like what that might look like.
Yeah, like I love cybersecurity and I plan to stay in cybersecurity for like my entire life because I'm just so passionate about it. And the one thing I like is there's always something to learn, right? I don't know if you can
Yeah.
see some of the like electronics
Yeah.
behind me. And so one of my passions is getting into this like hardware hacking and just getting these small devices and seeing what they can do. So, we're talking about maybe formalizing something around that. Some
Interesting.
of my social media posts that talk about like, hey, I got this device and I put this firmware on it and I made it like do this thing. People are really excited about that and interested in it, and it certainly interests me. So, that's one of the things that keeps me in cybersecurity is like my projects have projects, and there's
Yep.
always things that I want to do
Yeah.
that are just cool and fun and and learning. So,
Yeah.
that's certainly part of it. Is I'm a nerd at heart, and so it allows me to be a nerd, I think, in a very productive way
Yeah.
that also teaches people. So I also have a cigar podcast called the Stogie Geeks, and that's evolved over time to where today we're looking at a relaunch, and all of my friends in cybersecurity that smoke cigars, well, a subset of them are now hosts on that show. So it's like cybersecurity
Great.
nerds talking about cigars. So
Awesome.
this month we're planning on relaunching that and putting out some new episodes. So I'm super excited
That's super
about
cool.
that.
Awesome. Last question before we kind of wrap things up because we're hitting up on time is just um, on the hardware side. You mentioned you kind of like just will randomly pull things out of AliExpress. So anything that you've kind of gotten and tinkled with, or that you like were surprised that you're able to make do.
Yeah, I think there's a particular small chip that has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on it,
Okay.
and it's from a company called Espressive Systems. It's an ESP32, and they're super, super cheap, right? And this is the thing that fascinates me is like, back in the day, to get something that ran Wi-Fi was like $1,000 or more, right? In early 2000s. Now, for like a couple of dollars on AliExpress you can order a dozen of them. I mean, it's an exaggeration, but they're like literally like a couple of dollars a piece. And what you can do in them is just amazing. People are using them in home automation.
Oh,
There's
nice.
whole hacking projects out there on how to use it for security analysis. So that platform and chipset is amazing for me because of the low price tag and just all the things you can do with it. So if you're looking to get into cybersecurity, that's certainly a great project to have because it's low cost and there's lots of projects that are free for you to use and experiment with.
Awesome. On that note, I want to say thank you for taking the time. I'll definitely share and promote your different podcasts and interests to our community as well.
Thank you.
It's great to kind of have you on and just hear your story, and then just hear the passion behind how you talk about security, because I think that's something that is fairly unique, but it's definitely ingrained into you, and the origination and how you talked about it in the very beginning, and how that's all kind of culminated together into your detective work. It's all great.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. It was fun.
Awesome.